Hello, this is Garth Noyes. Sometime in late 2015, under the pseudonym G.K. Flint, I released the first episode of A History of the King James Bible podcast. The genesis, no pun intended, of the series occurred in 2011 on the 400th anniversary of the publication of the King James Version of the Bible. At that time, I went looking for a podcast series about the King James Version and found while there were a few standalone releases, there was no in-depth series about this most important book. I thought to myself, someone should do that. At the time, I didn't think that person would be me. A few years later, I again went online looking for a series concerning the history of the King James Version of the Bible. It still hadn't been done, so I thought, I'm going to have a crack at it. I then gathered some resources, did the research, and hit record. Over the course of about 18 months, beginning in late 2015, I released 22 episodes of the series, the final episode being released in June 2017. Since its release, I have received the occasional email from listeners, some to thank me for the series, and others asking if there will be further episodes. I have no plans to add to the series, but I thought perhaps I should share the series on YouTube so that others might have a chance to hear it. Which brings us to October 2020, and the series now being made available on YouTube. Any references to the now defunct website or different email addresses can be ignored as you go through the series. If you do wish to contact me, you can email me at gkjames1611@gmail.com. That's gkjames1611 gkjames1611@gmail.com. I will check this email intermittently, so please be patient if you do write. I have already stated the reason I decided to create this series, but my research into the translators unquestionably motivated me to get the research down and to hit record. It is clearly my favourite part of this work. So I am now thrilled anew in October and November of 2020 to offer on YouTube my study on the translators of the King James Bible. So here now for your enjoyment is my original series, A History of the King James Bible podcast.
Welcome, friends, to A History of the King James Bible podcast. To find more episodes and information, just go to our website, www.ahistoryofthekingjamesbiblepodcast.com. Now here is GK with the latest episode.
Welcome to A History of the King James Bible podcast. This is episode 10, The First Cambridge Company. In this episode, we're going to meet the translators of the First Cambridge Company, so I thought it might be fitting to share some basic info about Cambridge University that is relevant to the series. I realise I didn't do this in the last episode for the First Westminster Company, so let me just take you back to Westminster just for a brief overview. Then we will go from that to our overview of Cambridge, and then we'll meet the members of the First Cambridge Company. I think you're going to find some of these guys just as interesting as I think the First Westminster blokes were. So this will be a few minutes reading, a couple of sections from Opfel's The King James Bible Translators, and then, as I said, we are off to meet the team. Filled with tombs and stately monuments, Westminster Abbey has been the site of many great historical events, from coronations to burials. Its name derives from a time when it served as the church of an old Benedictine monastery. Henry III tore down the original Norman church in the mid-13th century and began to construct a magnificent French Gothic church. In 1539, it became the seat of a bishop and was designated a cathedral. But a dean has headed the abbey since the days of Queen Elizabeth, who refounded it as the Collegiate Church of St. Peter, Westminster, with 1 dean and 11 prebendaries, all appointed by the sovereign and independent of episcopal authority. Dean and prebendaries, forming a body corporate known as the Dean and Chapter, were responsible for the fabric, finances, and general government of the abbey, the dean exercising general supervision over all. James named the scholarly Dean of Westminster, Lancelot Andrews, first of all, to the group of learned men who were to make a new translation of the Bible. Andrews suggested other scholars and assisted in the preliminary arrangements. Okay, so that's just a little bit about Westminster, which I didn't cover in episode 9. So let's now go to Cambridge, and then following that we'll go straight to meeting our translators. In 1604, the primary function of the two great universities of Cambridge and Oxford was still to turn out churchmen. For good reason, Cambridge was called the Nursery of Divines, and at the same time a finishing school for the sons of well-to-do gentlemen. Its new students, unless they were under 14, were compelled to take a matriculation oath, dedicating themselves to piety and good letters. The statutes of Trinity College, for example, called for prayers to be read each morning and evening in chambers. Students wearing the required surplices, for which they paid 2 shillings apiece, were expected to report at 5 o'clock each morning for an hour-long service. When all were assembled in the great hall for meals, each student in turn had to read aloud from a Bible placed on a desk in the middle of the room. In spite of such enforced piety, Cambridge enjoyed a heady reputation of rebellion against the ruling church. Whereas Oxford fostered the careers of many leading Catholic figures in Tudor times, most of the reformers in England came from Cambridge. While the Catholic Mary was on the throne, a group of these reformers fled to Geneva to fall under the spell of John Calvin. In 1558, with Mary's death and Elizabeth's accession, the exiles trooped back to England, many resettling in Cambridge. There, in 1570, Thomas Cartwright, a Fellow of Trinity, presented a series of lectures about a possible new and holier Church of England, based on the Geneva pattern. Another time, he vehemently attacked the custom of wearing the surplice, a popish reminder. Finally, an irate John Whitgift, then Master of Trinity, had him expelled for insolent audacity. Already at the university, Cartwright and his fellow reformers were being tagged Puritans, a name given in derision. By 1604, there were 3 broadly defined groups of Puritans. Cartwright's party was moderately radical, wishing to cast out the fat and strutting bishops, pomp-fed prelates, and to change from episcopacy to John Calvin's notion of presbytery. A less radical group wanted only some Protestant alterations in ritual. The most radical group of all pushed for completely autonomous congregations. To the most moderate wing belonged the 4 Puritans who came to the Hampton Court Conference. You remember those 4 guys, the ones that had to kneel down before King James? In 1603, the millenary petition had shocked official Cambridge. So that was, if you remember in early episodes, we talked about the millenary petition that was given to James on his way to taking the throne by Puritans. It was called millenary because it was supposedly signed by 1,000 ministers asking for changes and further reformation to the English church. So back to the reading. In 1603, the millenary petition had shocked official Cambridge, which issued a reproof to the ministers who had signed it. A formal university resolution thereupon affirmed that anyone who dared oppose the doctrine and discipline of the Church of England would automatically lose his degree, already taken or to be taken. Nonetheless, the Puritan ethic was still strong at Cambridge when James picked his scholars there. Chief stronghold of the Puritans was Emmanuel College. The men the king named to the first Cambridge Company, almost all had Trinity connections. The revenues of Trinity made it the richest foundation in the university. As a consequence, it was architecturally magnificent. Thomas Neville, its ambitious master since 1593, built a great court with a large plashing fountain to rival Christ Church's spacious quad. Behind the ornate gates, the college was self-contained, with its own vegetable garden, bakehouse, wash-house, cooper house, meal house, capon house, and even swan house. Reminds me of a tune. A church house, gin house, a schoolhouse, outhouse, on Highway number 19. The people keep the city clean. And moving on swiftly, my wife, who listens to these episodes on her commute to work, says I've got to turn down the corn factor. I don't know if I'll be able to do that, but let's see. It may have been the college with the strictest discipline. In 1560, new statutes announced that deans were to give sedulous attention to the matter of discipline. Absence from prescribed public worship and college prayer services resulted in fines for those over 18. Those under this age were chastened with rods in the hall. Always attired in long gowns and square caps, its students, like all the other students at the university, were of three classes: fellow commoners, the sons of the landed gentry or noblemen; commoners, pensioners. So I think pensioners is a student who is not a scholar or a sizar, and I'll talk about that a bit later, what a sizar is. And they pay for their own tuition and commons. Okay, so I'll start again about the three classes. You had fellow commoners, the sons of the landed gentry or noblemen; commoners, or pensioners, the sons of clergymen, small landowners and businessmen; and sizars, and it's in bracketed here called bateleurs. And in Australia, the little Aussie battler is something totally different to this, but again, I will listen to my wife's advice and move on. So the sizars were the sons of yeomen and tenants. To sizars were assigned the comfortless chambers without fire and the tasks of bed-making, water-fetching and chamber sweeping. Fellow commoners sat at the high table with the fellows. Sizars ate in the kitchen. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of Westminster and Cambridge. I will remind you that there were 6 companies assigned the task of translating the King James Version, with 2 each from Westminster, Cambridge and Oxford. The heads over each institution's teams were the directors. So, for example, the first Westminster Company, the director was Lancelot Andrews, and for the second Westminster Company, William Barlow was head or leader of the second Westminsters. So, the director of your first company is responsible overall for the first and second company. And, just to muddy the billabong a little more for you, Andrews and Bancroft basically were running the whole show overall over top of that as well. But we'll get into more of that as we go along. Okay, so moving on, keeping our introduction to Cambridge University in mind, let's now meet the director of the first Cambridge Company, chosen to lead the team that was to translate First Chronicles to the Song of Solomon. Cambridge was and still is a prestigious institution, and it is somewhat ironic that the leader of the first Cambridge Company was a very poor man. Having spent 30 years as Regius Professor at Trinity College, Cambridge, Edward Lively was a father of 13 reportedly very hungry children. There are differing reports as to who survived whom. One has it that he died leaving his wife and children destitute, another that his wife died first and he struggled to raise the children on his own. Either way, you can't help but feel for all of them. By the time that the translation had begun, 2 of his children had already died. Lively was a noted linguist and author of the time, and most importantly, a well-known Hebraist. He also made a living on the side as a hack writer. But it wasn't all hack. He wrote a number of Latin works, and perhaps his best-known work is his chronology of the Persian monarchy. Lively was chosen for the work because not only was he good at his Hebrew, he was a great organiser. This, despite the fact that he was often pursued by creditors, at one stage having had all his worldly possessions seized, which must have been well tough with 13 kiddies, I can imagine. In 1602 he had received some preferment from Bancroft and made prebendary of Peterborough. A prebendary is a senior member of clergy, normally supported by the revenues from an estate or parish, and you will remember that Bancroft was the one whom James put in charge of setting the rules for this project. Sadly, Edward Lively died in 1605, and I read that his death certainly slowed the work of the translation. The preacher at his funeral indicated that earnest study and pains about the translation hastened Lively's death. Before he died, though, he did pass on to the other translators his procedure for discovering the exact shades of meaning, as Opfel puts it. His procedure was to cite as many passages as he could where the same phrase occurred and, by careful examination and comparison, draw a conclusion. So that basically is saying he passed on, the way he translated the Bible to the others before he died. And we're going to find out who the replacement director was. He'll be the last member of this team that we discuss here. Our next translator for the first Cambridge company that we're going to meet is John Richardson, another noted Hebraist. At the time of the translation, he was Regius Professor of Divinity and later was Master of Trinity College. In his early years, Richardson had been a Sizar at Clare Hall, Cambridge, at the same time as Dutch Thompson of the First Westminster Company. Do you remember him? The bloke who enjoyed a bit of plonk while translating. A Sizar is a student who receives some form of assistance such as meals, lower fees or lodging during his or her period of study, and in some cases in return for doing a defined job. Later, Richardson was a fellow at Emmanuel College. At Cambridge, fellows form the governing body of the colleges. Let's turn again to Opfel to learn a little bit more about Richardson and life at Cambridge.
Later, as a fellow of Emmanuel, he advanced towards his doctorate. Fellows were chosen by the heads of college and other fellows. In addition to their teaching duties, they had a share in college administration, helping the heads with the problems of property, from which rents were derived. Normally a fellow had the company of 5 or 6 pupils, who slept on trundle beds below or around his bed. Like all the others working for the Bachelor of Arts degree, the young men studying under Richardson were preoccupied with rhetoric, Quintilian, Hermogenes, Cicero, and logic, Aristotle and his interpreters. Their examinations consisted of debating Latin theses. In addition, they read Greek and Latin writers, the Church Fathers and philosophy, where again Aristotle was emphasised. Fellows who presided over such a rigorous curriculum were often somewhat forbidding, but the corpulent Richardson was known for an exceedingly likeable personality. At his death in 1625, the same year King James died, he was deeply mourned. Matching Richardson, many Elizabethans and Jacobins did run to fat. Treachermen could enjoy a rich mingling of sweet and sour, exemplified in their filling minced pies. It was not uncommon for the well-to-do to breakfast in season on mutton stew, a joint of beef, veal pie, chicken, oranges, or pippins and wine. Lunch and dinner might be equally filling, but short on vegetables. University students' diet was more monotonous. William Harrison declared that Cambridge was exceedingly well served with all kinds of provision, but especially of freshwater fish and fowl, by reason of the river that passeth by. Still, those at table in the lower part of the college hall were customarily given beer, beef, rye bread and oatmeal, sometimes peas, and a little fruit for dinner, which was served shortly before noon. Breakfast was a catcher's can affair, often with a draught of beer. Supper, rather Spartan, was at 5. However, sitting on his bench at the high table, a worthy like Richardson could drink burgundy instead of beer and dine more sumptuously on lark and capon pies, jellies and marzipan.
Yes, so what do you think about that, having a bit of beer for breakfast? I like how Opfel put it there. Breakfast was a catcher's can affair, often with a draught of beer. I couldn't imagine that myself, but anyway. Let's move on now to a very interesting member of the first Cambridge company, Laurence Chaderton. You might recall that Chaderton was one of the Puritans who took his knee before the king for a right haranguing at the Hampton Court Conference. Born into a Catholic family in the 1530s, Chaderton was disinherited after becoming a Protestant. In 1564 he had entered Christ's College at Cambridge, something his wealthy family had abhorred. You see, his father had wanted him to study law as a Catholic and offered him an allowance of 30 quid if he agreed. Chaderton's father wrote the following to him. Son Laurence, if you will renounce the new sect which you have joined, you must expect all the happiness which the care of an indulgent father can assure you. Otherwise, I enclose a shilling to buy a wallet. Go and beg. That's pretty rough, isn't it? Oh, my goodness. So he offered him 30 quid if he would quit and go and get a law degree, or here's a shilling and go and beg. It was a bit rough. Okay, anyway, so Laurence decided to stay at Cambridge, obtaining a scholarship, ultimately leading to a fellowship. Working at Christ's College as a dean, a tutor, and a lecturer, his expertise in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew was widely known. He also knew French, Spanish, and Italian, so by my reckoning, including English, that makes him proficient in 7 languages. Chaderton ruled at Emmanuel College, Cambridge for 38 years. And I think we mentioned it earlier, it was a hotbed of Puritanism, and at different stages, both Queen Elizabeth and King James aired their concerns about the place. After the shellacking the Puritans were given at the Hampton Court Conference, not just by James, but also by Bancroft, I did wonder why the likes of Bancroft would even consider Chaderton for a place on the Translators list. I'm saying this because, we just discussed that he converted to Protestantism and he was found among the Puritans. But then I found this little tale. Back in their uni days, Chaderton didn't mind a brawl or two, as he was apparently quite a burly fellow. Anyway, as the story goes, he almost lost a hand while saving the younger Bancroft, who was involved in the student blue at a town and gown brawl. My apologies for the Aussism there. A blue is just a brawl or a fight. It means the same thing. So perhaps this is why Bancroft didn't oppose Chaderton's nomination on the Translators list. Typical of the Puritan preachers at the time, Chaderton could preach up a storm. On one occasion, after taking a break from 2 hours of sharing and analysing the scriptures during a sermon at Cambridge, the whole congregation stood as one and shouted, "Go on, for God's sake, go on." And he did, for another hour. Think how that compares to our postmodern church. We can barely sit still for an hour, some of us looking at our watches or phones nowadays, thinking about the big game or some reality show that will be on TV that afternoon when we get home. Maybe we might pick up a hot chook from the deli on the way home for lunch, maybe a pizza. Chaderton made a great innings, having lived until he was 103. He married into a family with Puritan connections. He had one daughter who cared for him well into his old age. And, at the announcement of his retirement, no less than 40 churchmen said that they owed their conversion to Christ to his preaching, and they asked him not to quit. Another story about Chaderton goes that even as he approached 100 years old, he was still at his studies and could be found reading his Greek Testament in small type without the aid of spectacles. What an interesting man. We should move on, but I want to share just one more anecdote. The Chaderton household wasn't short of a quid, and they had a couple of servants. And it was said that he was more concerned about their souls than he was about their service. And I also read that this was typical of Puritan heads of households. They saw it as their duty to see that not only their wife and children knew the Lord, but anyone who was under their household, under their roof, they took responsibility for the saving of their souls, which I think is quite sweet, to be honest. Okay, so let's move on from Chaderton, wonderful old guy. So we will now go to Thomas Harrison. Thomas Harrison matriculated as a pensioner at Trinity College, Cambridge, and later became a fellow and tutor there, and he wound up with a Doctor of Divinity degree also. Probably best known for his skill with the Greek language, he also had a reputation for his skills with both Greek and Hebrew idioms. Idioms are an important feature to be aware of when learning any language, especially antique ones. An idiom is just a phrase or expression that has a figurative meaning, but sometimes they have literal meanings. An example in Australia might be if someone is trying to trick you or deceive you somehow, you might say, "Don't come the raw prawn with me, mate," meaning don't take me for a fool. So that's an Aussie idiom. Now, for native Australian speakers, we all know what it means. But just for example's sake, let's say in 2,000 years, if it was written down somewhere and it was unearthed by someone in the future, they may have no idea what it refers to, because what has a raw prawn got to do with trying to make a fool of someone? So idioms are important, and I see why Harrison was on the first Cambridge Company panel. Our next translator is Roger Andrews, the younger brother of Lancelot Andrews. Roger wore a lot of hats during his lifetime. Let's just list some of them here. He was an ordained deacon and priest, a fellow of Pembroke at Cambridge. He was a doctor of divinity, a college master. He was a vicar and a rector and a prebendary, a chancellor, an archdeacon. He became an archdeacon of Chichester, and you might recall his brother Lancelot was the Bishop of Chichester. So he wore a lot of hats. So there's either lots of talent here or lots of preferential treatment. It might be unfair to say that, but it looks like he held some of these positions at the same time, like being a vicar of a couple of parishes while also being the rector of another. Now, as far as I can work out, he was not quite the scholar his brother was, so that also adds to my suspicions about preferment. And bear in mind, at this time, the Anglican Church was heavily criticised for allowing what they called plural parsons, and that's churchmen with more than one income stream. I think I said it earlier in an earlier episode, there were many good preachers and churchmen who could not earn a living and keep their families while preaching the gospel. So it seemed to some at the time a very unfair practice because these offices were handed out. And for the most part, you had to have friends in high places to score a paid position, or two, or maybe three. Roger, what say ye? Let's move on. Let's meet our next translator, the lifelong bachelor and the vicar of Wilden in Bedfordshire, Francis Dillingham. Dillingham was a noted Greek scholar, and he was an author and was known for his marriage advice. Let's turn to Opfel for more about his views on marriage. I wonder how this is going to go down in the 21st century. I might have my wife read this one. I might get her to read it cold. If I don't return for episode 11, I hope you remember me fondly. Here we go.
A lifelong bachelor, he believed nonetheless in marriage for clerics. Feeling he had a sure prescription, he published in 1609 a treatise called A Golden Key Opening the Lock to Eternal Happiness, which strongly advocated the subjection of wives. Simply, a husband kept his wife subject to him. Prudence teacheth the wife that her husband is head, and so subjecteth himself unto him. No marvel then, though many men have not their wives in subjection, for they have married fools, which know not their place. On another page, Dillingham wrote, He that would have a wife in subjection, let him match with a religious woman, for a religion teacheth her subjection. His advocacy of wifely obedience was not unlike that offered in Proverbs, one of the books he helped translate. Indeed, both Old and New Testaments proclaimed that a man must govern his wife and family.
What did you think of that? You had a bit of a smile on your face part way through there. What part was it?
Prudence teacheth the wife that her husband is her head, and so subjecteth herself unto him. No marvel then that many men have not their wives in subjection.
Why?
For they've married fools, which know not their place.
You're listening to a History of the King James Bible podcast with GK. The series is now available on iTunes. Just go to iTunes and search for a History of the King James Bible podcast with G.K. Flint as the author. If you enjoy this series, please leave a rating and a review. You can also find links to every episode at our website. Just head to www.ahistoryofthekingjamesbiblepodcast.com. Now let's get back to this episode with your host, G.K.
Well, that was a bit of fun. I want to take this opportunity to say a big g'day to a couple of you. Greetings to Alice in Virginia. Thank you for your supportive comments. I really appreciate them. And g'day to Jim in Mississippi. Thanks for your email. It was very, very good to hear from you. And thanks to Tim in Oklahoma. Thank you for taking the time to write. I appreciate that. And thank you to everyone else who has taken the time to write. I appreciate you taking the time. It's funny, since launching the King James Bible podcast, a number of you have written and let me know that you've been listening to, this show obviously, but also, Light Flint Radio for some time now. And, since I launched the History of the King James Bible podcast, a number of you have sort of popped up and said, g'day, hey, I've been listening for a while. It's been really, really nice. And I've made some wonderful new friends, mostly from the USA and a few, from here in the wonderful land of Oz. And it's been really, really nice. Now I need your help. I want to run a brief survey. Before I tell you about that, I want you to know that if you do write to me, your email address remains confidential. I won't pass it on or sell it to a list or anything like that, because as I'm sure you know by now, I've got nothing to sell. I've got no one to sell it to. Everything that we do is offered for free. And if you'll take note of our websites, my websites, there's no donation button or anything like that. If you like the show, all I ask is you can write and let me know. I really appreciate that. And mostly, the best that you can do for me is to share the show. And, I really want to say thanks to everyone who has done that. Okay. So now to my brief survey. I've had a lot less feedback since the release of episode 9, which was our first episode about the translators themselves. And the stats have remained stable, but the feedback has actually decreased. So here's a survey question. Thinking of episode 9 and episode 10, and that's the episode you're listening to now. So thinking of episode 9 and episode 10, did you find them not as good as, or better than all of the previous episodes? So I'm trying to work out what's going on here, so I'll repeat. Thinking of episode 9 and 10, did you find them not as good as, or better than all of the previous episodes? Please take the time and write to me and let me know. gk@lightflintradio.com. That's lowercase, all lowercase, gk@lightflintradio.com. And that will help me with the planning of future episodes. I have many, many more episodes to come, and I want to make sure I'm hitting the mark there with my audience. To be honest, I'm enjoying this. I'm loving the research for my own personal edification. I got my own reasons for doing this, and I'm thinking probably the last episode I'll probably share a bit of a testimony of my relationship with the King James Version. I really haven't gone into that too much. I'm trying to, I'm just trying to provide you with some history, a bit of entertainment, bit of fun along the way, and sharing what I'm finding. But perhaps in the last episode, I'll share my relationship with the King James Version, which ultimately really is why, which led to this. But that's a very, very long story and a bit of an old one. Okay, so please excuse this short interruption. I just want to say that since I recorded that segment there where I was asking for some assistance with the survey, I've received a number of emails, and the feedback has sort of ended up around about where it normally is. But that being said, I just want to be honest with my audience and let you know that's happened. That's why I'm sort of doing this little segment here. But what I'd still like to do is, if you could just go ahead and take the survey as it is and let me know how we're travelling. Are these episodes that pertain to the translators themselves, are they as good as the previous episodes? Are you enjoying them as much? So even though I have received a lot of feedback, a lot of it's come sort of late and late in the cycle and recent, but I'd still like to get some feedback, see what you think of the translators episode. So that's still, that survey question still applies for episode 9 and 10. Okay, so thank you for taking the time. Now, one more thing. Alrighty, let's move on. Let's get back to episode 10. Episode 10, The First Cambridge Company. So what did you think of Frankie Dillingham's marriage advice? I think I mentioned it earlier there that he was a lifelong bachelor, but he was all for clergymen to be married. So we'll move on from that one to our next translator, Andrew Byng. Now, Andrew Byng was one of the younger members of the First Cambridge Company. In fact, he outlived the other learned men by a long way. Said to have a perpetual smile on his face, Byng was another noted Hebraist, and I've used that term a couple of times. It's just expert in Hebrew. He took his Doctor of Divinity in 1606 and became and became a professor of Hebrew in 1608. Both of these taking place during the translation, and later he became a Regius Professor as well, like a few others on this panel. He too, like our old mate Roger Andrews, received many preferments. For example, he was a subdeacon, a vicar, a rector, and I think he held a couple of those positions at the same time, so another plural parson amongst the First Cambridge Company. Our final member of the First Cambridge Company was Robert Spalding, perhaps a distant relative of my mate Mike from Lima. I wonder. Robert Spalding succeeded Edward Lively, this company's director, as Regius Professor of Hebrew at Cambridge, and it's thought that he also took over as the director of the company after the death of Lively, early into the beginning of the work. So if you remember, the original director of the company, the first gentleman we spoke about was Edward Lively, and he died very early into the work on the translation. It's thought that Spalding took over his role as both this company's director and Regius Professor of Hebrew at Cambridge. Okay, so there you have all the members of the First Cambridge Company. It was full of scholars. It had vicars, professors, fellows, experts in Hebrew and Greek. And don't forget our friend Harrison, who was also good with the ancient idioms, and we spoke about that and why that was important. So all in all, really a great mob of scholars. Let's now take a brief look at some of their work. Keep in mind I have plans for a more detailed look at the translation itself in upcoming episodes, so we'll just have a quick look here at some of their work. I'm going to turn once again to Opfel for an introduction to this section, and then I'm just going to pick a couple of points that she makes about their work, and then we'll finish up. The earlier English translations were to give a sturdy foundation to the work of the Cambridge panel. Butterworth, the tracer of literary lineage, concludes that from 1 Chronicles to Esther, the Cambridge men depended on the Geneva Bible, the Matthew Bible, and the Great Bible. He notes that since after 2 Chronicles, the Matthew Bible copied Coverdale's revision of 1535. Coverdale set the standard for the Cambridge panel here. As far as the poetical books are concerned, the King James men moved freely. Of influences, the Geneva Bible was the most important to them, particularly in Job. Now, don't forget, I'm going to take you back to, we've spoken about this a number of times, that King James wasn't necessarily against the Geneva Bible itself, he was against its annotations. But I think we've mentioned it a couple of times here. It might have even been with the first Westminster guys that the Geneva had heavy influence on them. But Opfel saying here that up till 1 Chronicles it was other editions, but once they hit 2 Chronicles, Geneva weighed in very heavily on their influence. So I'll just start here again. Of influences, the Geneva Bible was the most important to them, particularly in Job. The Bishop's Bible gave some help with Proverbs, but there were many instances where the King James revisers made their own incomparable music, as in Job 38, regarded by many scholars as the most beautiful chapter in the entire Bible. It begins, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" The 7th verse of the chapter had gone through several renderings. So we're going to look at 4 of those. We're going to look at Coverdale, Matthew and Bishop's, Geneva, and then we're going to look at the King James. And this 7th verse will be very, very relevant to many of you listening, I'm sure. So Job, chapter 38, verse 7. Coverdale reads, "When the morning stars gave me praise, and when all the angels of God rejoiced." Matthew and Bishop's Bible reads, "When the morning stars praised me together, all the children of God rejoiced triumphantly." The Geneva Bible reads, "When the stars of the morning praised me together, and all the children of God rejoiced." Now, as Opfel puts it, it bursts forth in King James. "When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So, some people are more auditory, but I prefer to see it written down. So, for some of you there, you might just wind that back and have a little listen to the differences there. But for me, it's easy to see it in the written form. Okay, so, another example. Let's look at an example from Psalms. So Offel says, dealing with the Psalms, the company took a few phrases from some English primers and a translation attributed to George Joy, but most frequently they borrowed from Coverdale and the Geneva Bible. There's the Geneva again. Geneva had become Psalm 23, so very famous psalm here. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to rest in green pasture, and leadeth me by the still waters. This was refined to, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. In the final verse, King James scholars, borrowing the last clause from the Great Bible, made another stylistic improvement over Geneva. The Geneva reads, doubtless kindness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall remain a long season in the house of the Lord. The King James reads, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. In Proverbs, they move through earlier renderings to a sweet rhythm. The Coverdale, the Great Bible, and the Bishop's Bible read, her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths peaceable. King James reads, her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. So that was Proverbs 3:17. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 6, the working materials of the great style were supplied by the Geneva Bible. Set me as a seal on thine heart, as a signet upon thine arm. For love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave, the coals thereof are fiery coals, and a vehement flame. The subtle changes of the King James men made even more magic. Set me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave, the coals thereof are coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame. And as Opfel puts it here, the rest of the Old Testament lay in the hands of the Oxford scholars. Now, Oxford scholars is a term my brother uses for dollars, so if he says I'll give you $100, he will say I'll give you 100 Oxford scholars. So with those Oxford scholars in mind, be sure to join me next time on a History of the King James Bible podcast, where I will introduce you to the first Oxford Company. So until next time, take care of yourself, God bless, and hooroo.